Based upon conversations I had about the Chicago teachers strike, right, from I guess now 5 years ago, maybe it was. My understanding is that the Chicago Teachers Union was consciously building relationships in the community to I mean, both in anticipation of the possibility of a strike, but to broadly make, I mean, as part of a sort of a social union movement, as opposed to the managerial model. Was any of that going on in West Virginia? Did you talk to any of the teachers? And I should say, as a subsidiary question, what is the union leadership like? Because we saw them make a deal, I guess it was a week ago, and basically their rank and file said, no, we're not taking that deal.
Well, I think it's a complex question, both of these questions. The first part about community support is it was very widespread. A part of this was that, a lot of these teachers are already very heavily involved in the community and involved in community organizations. And there's been an effort underway really over the last decade as teachers' unions have been under attack to make a lot more community engagement. And I think those efforts have accelerated as unions face the threat of the Janus case, which would take away agency fees, the ability to collect dues off of everybody in a bargaining unit. So we've seen a lot of that. And during the strike, we saw, food drives for students, daycare sent up. The teachers really went out of their way to make sure that they could help provide for students during the strike. The second part of the question is, it's tough for me to really gauge what the leadership is like and what kind of deal they cut. Part of their thinking here was there was a deep fear always of having an injunction placed on them. An injunction can mean that you round up teachers, but it also means you can sue a union and bankrupt that union. So part of the reason they were so quick to cut a deal was that they were scared an injunction could come down at any time. So I think they cut a deal. And then when they got pushback from their membership, they went back to the table. It's not really clear to me what happened beyond that point, but it was clear, since it happened in so many different counties, but it was clear that a lot of people in a lot of different counties weren't willing to take that deal. And I think by going back out, they presented even more fear because a union leader can go to the bargaining table and say, hey, I don't even know if I can get my members to accept this. So they really, by going back out again, we're able to push this, 5% raise for all public employees.
I mean, that seems to me to be a fairly decent negotiating tactic, right? I mean, I don't know how you can manage that on a planned basis, but the idea that you're, that leadership can head back to the table and say, look, we just, we can't force our members to take something that they all sort of. I mean, there's a consistency between the members pushing back on the leadership and just the concept of a wildcat strike in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, and also from a legal standpoint, the union had met its obligation as union leaders to end the strike at that point. So they were really outside of legal risk. And I think at that point, the union was willing to support this going on for much longer. And I think they showed a lot of strength, and I think it's going to have ripple effects. The Oklahoma Education Association, for instance, did a survey of its 10,000 members to see if they were interested in striking, and 80% of them said they were interested in striking this year. In Pittsburgh, for instance, they were negotiating a teachers' union contract while this was going on, and Pittsburgh is only about 45 minutes from West Virginia, where I live in Pittsburgh. And we share a media market with West Virginia. So there was a lot of coverage here in the Pittsburgh media market of the West Virginia teacher strike. And what winded up happening is that, last Monday, not this Monday, but last week, teachers in Pittsburgh voted to strike, and they gave 96 hours notice. Within 2 days, the school district had folded because they didn't want a repeat of what was happening in West Virginia.
Interesting.
So, this is going to have ripple effects for a very long time. Just as I think you're right, the Chicago teachers strike had a lot of ripples effects in terms of the militancy of that union. Because, you have to remember the early Obama years, right? Obama was pushing charter schools, merit pay, all these things to hurt teachers' unions. And that Chicago teacher strike was really the first time in a big way that union pushed back against the Democratic Party. And now we're seeing just not pushing back against the Democratic Party, but being willing to break the law and take on people, in the Republican Party as well as other parties. And I think now with the current dynamic versus Trump, I think you're going to see a lot more willingness of public unions that are under attack to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, I want to circle back to that in a moment, and also just note that particularly relevant about that Chicago teacher strike was that Arne Duncan was the superintendent of the schools who went on to be the Secretary of Education for the Obama administration. So there was a real, a direct a rejection of all that Arne Duncan and the Obama administration represented. But I want to just also highlight what you'd mentioned about the teachers and their relationship with the community. They had food drives. You just mentioned it briefly, but I want to just have you just give us a little bit a better sense of that. They had food drives for students, and as well as providing daycare. And the food drives for students, of course, is really important because there's a lot of students who will go without a breakfast and a lunch if it wasn't for school on a daily basis. And I imagine the number of free lunch students in West Virginia in certain areas is very high.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
a lot of teachers told me stories of paying bills for their students, over the years. That there wasn't anything they wouldn't do, but at a certain point, push comes to shove, and you gotta, it's like the fireman's rule, right? You gotta take care of yourself before you can take care of anyone else. And if you can't pay your bills, how are you supposed to teach?
Right, and so I mean let us. All right. Well, so what was it that was ultimately the deal that the teachers were able to wrangle from the state?
So they were able to get a 5% raise. In addition, the governor vowed to veto any bills taking away seniority rights for teachers, promoting charter schools, promoting alternative teacher certification, as well as any bills, eliminating dues checkoff for political contributions for union members. So they defeated all those anti-union legislation as well. In addition, the governor agreed to freeze all out-of-pocket health insurance costs for 19 months for the teachers. In the interim period, they have set up a task force to present recommendations on how to fix the state health insurance plan. This task force is set to give its report in early October before the state legislature reconvenes. So if the state legislature at that time doesn't vote to fix PEIA, then it'll be a big election issue, and I think the union's really fired up for the election. So while they couldn't win all the long-term health insurance issues they wanted, they did fix it for 19 months. Ultimately, fixing this PEIA health insurance issue, the state health insurance program, is going to require taxing frackers more, which is what the governor of the state has proposed, and the Republicans in the legislature have voted against. So really, I mean, this comes down to, do you want to tax frackers more or pay teachers more?
And is it? Am I correct? And my understanding is that they secured a 5% raise not just for themselves but for all state workers.
Yeah, which was more than they had initially set out to do. So this was a big victory because they got a lot of solidarity from other state workers, and at a certain point, there started to be high call-off rates of state workers who were going to rallies, and there was talk among other state workers unions of maybe striking in solidarity in wildcat strikes. So I think, initially that wasn't on the table to match the public employees. But as this process got going, they were able to throw that on the table. That seems
pretty amazing to me. I mean, is that something that has happened on a? I mean, is that something that occurs on a fairly regular basis, where you have one public sector union strikes and they end up getting raises for every other public sector worker?
I mean, I'm not an expert. I mean, I'm sure it's happened, but it's not something you hear about all the time. And it's important to remember that this was happening in the context of them not having collective bargaining.
Right.
So typically when people are negotiating contracts, it happens in a collective bargaining situation where you have one contract for one group of workers, and you can't, you can coordinate to some degree, but you can't do that. In this context, since they didn't have collective bargaining rights, it was about, basically striking to force the legislature. And we see unions do this in other states in the South. And I think what this strike really showed is you have this Janus case coming down now. And I think what it showed is, hey, you can take away certain union rights and still, have a strong union on the shop floor, like you saw in West Virginia, where they don't even have collective bargaining rights.
I want to circle back to that in a second too. But in terms of the funding for the raises, it was reported yesterday, or I saw it that the local West Virginia reporter said that the Senate. The president of the Senate said that he anticipates the money coming out of Medicaid and perhaps other budget cuts. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so it's projected from the governor that they should get $58 million more in revenue. Some of that revenue is coming from cuts to the state tourism budget as well as the economic development budget. However, if they don't meet those revenues, something like $20 million might come out of Medicaid from the state. It's not clear at this point. Those are potential cuts if this projected revenue isn't met. So, it is kind of a draconian situation in that respect.
And what's the union's perspective on that? Have you heard any word as to what their perspective is on that?
Well, a lot of what was cut was corporate welfare programs. So we're talking about, running ads on TV saying, promoting West Virginia tourism and, giving away corporate tax cuts. There's only about $20 million, and the governor really says it's about $10 million cuts to Medicaid that might go into effect if these revenues aren't met. Right. These revenue projections aren't met. So, essentially they're kicking the can down the road, and the union's perspective is they're certainly going to fight those cuts if they come down.